There was nothing particularly memorable about that morning, except that it had rained overnight. I could tell by the mist on the windows and the faint scent of wet earth that clung to the air. I was running late, as usual, juggling my briefcase, phone, and a thermos of coffee that threatened to spill with every step. By the time I made it to the car parked neatly in the driveway, our driver, Victor, was already waiting inside, engine humming like a distant lullaby. Victor was a man of few words. A dependable guy, or so I had thought. He'd been driving for us for a little over a year, hired during a busy period when my work trips and long hours at the office became too much for my wife, Claire, to juggle alongside her own commitments. Having someone like him around had seemed practical, even necessary. But on that particular morning, practicality took a back seat to something far more unsettling. I opened the rear passenger door and slid inside, tossing my briefcase onto the seat beside me. That's when I saw it. A man's watch lying on the leather cushion, face down, strap slightly twisted, as if it had been hurriedly abandoned. I reached for it instinctively, turning it over in my hand. It was expensive, polished silver, thick leather band, and an engraving on the back that read, "To Jess, keep making memories." I frowned. It wasn't mine. I wasn't in the habit of misplacing things, and even if I were, I had never owned a watch like this. The initials, the inscription, they meant nothing to me. But as I sat there staring at it, the weight of what it could mean settled heavily in my gut. I glanced up at the rearview mirror, where Victor's eyes met mine briefly before he focused back on the road. His expression was unreadable, as always. The man didn't do small talk, and right then, I was grateful for it. My mind was spinning too fast to engage in polite conversation. By the time we reached the office, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to jump to conclusions just yet. There could be a logical explanation. Maybe it was Victor's watch, though that didn't seem likely. Or maybe one of Claire's friends had left it behind when she borrowed the car. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the cold, sinking feeling creeping up my spine. Later that night, after dinner, I brought it up. We were sitting in the living room, Claire on the couch with her legs curled under her, scrolling through her phone, and me pretending to watch the news. The watch sat on the coffee table between us, its silver face gleaming under the dim light. "Did you leave something in the car?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She glanced up, her brows furrowing slightly as her gaze fell on the watch. "What is that?" "Found it in the back seat this morning." She leaned forward, picked it up, and examined it briefly before setting it back down. "It's not mine." I already knew that, but hearing her say it made my chest tighten. "Then whose is it?" She shrugged a little too easily. "Maybe Victor's?" "I thought of that," I said, leaning back against the cushions. "But it doesn't seem like his style. Besides, there's an engraving." Her eyes flicked to the watch again, but only for a second. "It's probably nothing, honey. Don't overthink it." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I studied her. The way she crossed her arms casually, the way her gaze didn't linger too long on mine. If she was nervous, she hid it well. But I wasn't blind. There was something about her calmness that felt off. The watch sat there like a silent witness, daring me to push further. But for now, I let it go. There would be time for questions later. I wasn't ready to unleash the storm, not yet. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't over. The watch wasn't just a forgotten accessory. It was the start of something far more complicated. The watch stayed on the coffee table for the rest of the night, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Every time I glanced at it, my mind wandered to places I didn't want it to go. By the time we went to bed, Claire had completely brushed it off. She kissed me goodnight, as if the whole thing was nothing more than a misplaced item of no consequence. I tried to sleep, but my thoughts kept spinning, replaying the small details over and over. The engraving, the initials, the way Claire had dismissed it so easily. Maybe I was being paranoid, but something inside me refused to let it go. I stared at the ceiling, the faint glow of the moonlight cutting through the curtains, and decided I couldn't just ignore it. The next morning, I skipped breakfast, claiming I had an early meeting. Claire barely noticed. She was busy checking her phone again, scrolling through messages or whatever else she did to fill her mornings. I kissed her on the forehead and grabbed my keys, choosing to drive myself for once. I told Victor to take the morning off. He didn't ask why. which only made me more suspicious. I wondered if he knew what I was up to, or if he thought I'd already figured things out. The traffic gave me too much time to think, and by the time I reached the office, I was determined to find out who JS was. The engraving wasn't just decorative. It was a clue, whether Claire wanted to admit it or not. During my lunch break, I pulled out my phone and did what any half-suspicious husband would do. I searched for local jewelers, wondering if they'd remember engraving that particular watch. After a few calls, I struck gold. One jeweler remembered the initials and the engraving. When I asked if he could tell me who purchased it, he laughed. "I don't give out customer information over the phone," he said. "You'd have to come in?" I was about to hang up when he added, "But I can tell you this. It wasn't a woman who bought that watch. A man came in, and he seemed pretty particular about the engraving. That was all I needed to hear. Whoever JS was, he wasn't just some random guy who left his watch by accident. He'd put thought into it, enough to leave a message on the back that suggested memories had already been made, or that he wanted to make more." I didn't go back to work after lunch. Instead, I drove around aimlessly trying to calm down. The idea of Claire being unfaithful wasn't something I'd ever considered before. Sure, we had our ups and downs like any couple, but I had never doubted her loyalty. But now, everything seemed suspicious. Her late nights out with friends, the way she kept her phone close to her, even the fact that she'd been getting dressed up more than usual for what she called casual lunches. It was like a switch had flipped in my brain, and I couldn't turn it off. By the time I got home that evening, I had made another decision. I needed to check her phone. It felt wrong, intrusive even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers I needed were in there. I waited until she went upstairs to shower, and then grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter where she'd left it charging. She didn't have a passcode, something I used to admire her for, though now it made me wonder if she'd ever thought she had anything to hide. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through her messages. Most of them were harmless. Chats with friends, reminders about appointments, random social media notifications. And then I saw it, a conversation with Victor. I almost missed it at first, buried under the more recent messages. But when I opened it, my breath hitched. The messages weren't romantic, at least not directly, but they were far too familiar. Jokes about inside topics I wasn't privy to, references to places they'd been, times I didn't remember being part of. And then there it was, "Thanks for last night. Let's be more careful next time." I couldn't move. My thumb hovered over the screen, reading the words over and over until they lost meaning. My vision blurred and my mind raced. Was this what I thought it was, or was I twisting things in my head? But as I scrolled further, I saw another message. "You left something in the car. Don't worry, he won't notice." That's when I realized Claire knew about the watch. She'd seen it before I did, and chose to ignore it because she thought I wouldn't put the pieces together. By the time she came downstairs, wrapped in a towel with her wet hair dripping onto her shoulders, I had already put her phone back. I sat on the couch, the TV on in the background, but I wasn't watching. I heard her footsteps as she walked past me, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The air between us felt different that night. Claire probably didn't notice it, but I did. It was like sitting in a room with shattered glass on the floor, pretending you wouldn't get cut if you just stayed still. But I couldn't sit still anymore. Dinner was quiet. She asked me about work, and I responded with short, clipped answers. She didn't push. She never did. Not when it came to me being distant. Maybe that's why we'd lasted this long. But tonight her silence irritated me. I wanted her to ask, to probe, to notice that something wasn't right. Instead, she just cleared the dishes, humming a tune under her breath as if nothing had changed. I couldn't sleep again. Her breathing was steady beside me, her body warm under the covers. But I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the conversation with Victor playing on repeat in my head. Let's be more careful next time. I could feel the rage building, a slow, simmering burn that wouldn't let me rest. By morning, I had a plan. Claire had a weekly Pilates class on Fridays, which meant she'd be out of the house for at least 2 hours. Once she left, I called Victor. I kept my tone casual, told him I needed him to drive me to a meeting later in the afternoon. "Of course, sir," he said, his voice as steady and professional as ever. "What time should I come by?" 2 o'clock. Make sure the car's cleaned before then. I didn't care about the cleanliness of the car. I just wanted him to feel like nothing was out of the ordinary. I needed him off his guard. When Claire came home from Pilates, she looked flushed and happy, as if she'd just had the perfect start to her day. "Do you want breakfast?" she asked, tying her hair up into a messy bun. I shook my head. "I've got a lot of work to catch up on." She didn't press. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sipped it at the kitchen counter, and scrolled through her phone. I watched her from the corner of my eye, wondering if she was messaging him. Was she telling Victor about my call, warning him to be careful? Or did she feel so secure in her deception that she didn't think she had to? At exactly 2 o'clock, Victor pulled into the driveway. I saw him through the living room window, same calm expression, same black uniform, as if today was no different from any other day. But as I stepped outside and climbed into the car, I felt the weight of what was coming. "Afternoon, sir," he said, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "Afternoon," I replied. "Take me to the office." We drove in silence for a while. I watched the streets pass by, my fingers drumming against my leg. The air inside the car felt suffocating, thick with tension. Finally, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Victor," I said, my voice steady but cold, "do you know anyone with the initials JS?" There was a brief pause. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting mine for a split second before he looked back at the road. "Can't say I do, sir." The lie was obvious. His voice didn't waver, but his hands gripped the steering wheel just a little tighter. I noticed the way his shoulders tensed, the way his breathing seemed to quicken ever so slightly. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the back of his seat. "That's funny," I said, "because I found a watch with that engraving in the back seat of this car. And I know it's not mine." He didn't respond. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic clicking of the turn signal as we stopped at a red light. "I'm going to ask you again," I said, my voice lower now, more dangerous. "Do you know who JS is?" The light turned green, and he pressed on the gas, merging back into traffic. "I don't know anything about a watch, sir," he said finally, but his tone lacked conviction. I sat back, nodding slowly. "All right," I said. "Let's pretend that's true for now. But if I find out you're lying to me, Victor, you're going to wish you hadn't." We didn't speak for the rest of the ride. When we pulled up in front of my office, I got out without another word and slammed the door behind me. As he drove away, I stood there, watching the car disappear down the street, my mind racing with possibilities. The confrontation had been a test, and he'd failed. His reaction told me everything I needed to know. He was involved. I didn't know how deeply yet, but I would find out. When I walked into the office, my assistant greeted me with a stack of paperwork, but I barely registered her presence. My focus was elsewhere, on the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. Claire's denial, the watch, the messages with Victor, his nervous response. This wasn't just an affair. It was a betrayal so carefully hidden that it had taken me over a year to notice. But now that I had, there was no going back. I wasn't just disappointed. I was angry. And someone was going to pay for it. When I got home that evening, Claire was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she stirred a pot on the stove. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air, but it didn't calm me the way it used to. It was strange how quickly a home could feel foreign when trust started to crumble. She turned to greet me with a smile, her cheeks slightly flushed from the heat of the stove. "You're home early," she said. "Dinner's almost ready." I set my briefcase down by the door and loosened my tie, watching her closely. There wasn't a hint of guilt on her face, no trace of hesitation in her movements. If she knew about my conversation with Victor, she didn't show it. That, or she was a better actress than I'd given her credit for. "I wrapped up at work earlier than I thought," I said, forcing a neutral tone. She nodded and turned back to the stove, stirring the sauce with one hand while scrolling through her phone with the other. I wondered if she was texting him again, maybe setting up their next meeting. My fingers twitched with the urge to grab her phone and read every message, but I held back. There was a bigger plan forming in my head, and I needed to be patient. Over dinner, I tried to act normal, but my appetite was gone. I pushed the food around my plate, barely listening as she told me about her day. Something about meeting an old friend for coffee, A friend whose name she dropped so casually that it almost seemed rehearsed. I made a mental note to check if that friend was even in town. Every word she said sounded like a potential lie. I couldn't sit through the charade for long. After a few bites, I excused myself, claiming I had work to catch up on. She didn't question it. Why would she? She probably thought she had me fooled. But as I sat in my home office, pretending to type, I was already planning my next move. I needed more than just suspicions. The messages with Victor and the watch were damning, but they weren't enough to confront her the way I wanted to. I wanted her to have no room to deny it, no chance to twist the narrative. I wanted her to squirm, to feel the weight of what she'd done. Around midnight, when Claire was fast asleep, I slipped out of bed and quietly grabbed her phone from the nightstand. I took it to the bathroom, locking the door behind me before I sat down on the edge of the tub. My heart pounded as I unlocked it and went straight to her messaging app. The conversation with Victor was still there, but it hadn't progressed much since the last time I checked. I scrolled back further, searching for any details I might have missed. And that's when I found a photo. It wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. Claire was sitting in the back seat of our car, her head resting against Victor's shoulder, a soft smile on her face, as if she had no worries in the world. His arm was wrapped around her, and the angle of the photo suggested it had been taken in a moment of intimacy, probably after one of their careful meetups. I stared at it for a long time, my hands tightening around the phone. There was the proof I needed. No amount of denial could erase that image from my mind. I saved the photo to my own phone and then scrolled further, reading more of their messages. Some were brief, others flirtatious, but one in particular stopped me cold. Next week, same time? Of course, as long as he's not around. I didn't realize how hard I was gripping the phone until my fingers started to ache. They were careful, yes, but not careful enough. They'd gotten comfortable, sloppy even. They thought I was too busy to notice, too trusting to suspect a thing. But now, I had them exactly where I wanted them. By the time I returned to bed, the rage inside me had transformed into something colder, more calculated. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about making sure they both felt the consequences. The next day, I acted as if nothing had changed. I kissed Claire goodbye, told her to have a good day, and headed to work like any other morning. But instead of going to the office, I went to the garage where Victor parked the car. He was wiping down the hood when I approached, whistling a tune I didn't recognize. The sound grated on my nerves. "Morning, sir," he said, straightening up. His expression was calm, but I noticed the way his gaze flicked to me and then away, like he couldn't hold eye contact for too long. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone even. "Can I have a word?" "Of course." He set the rag down and leaned against the car, folding his arms over his chest. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us until we were face to face. "You've been with us for over a year now," I said, "and I've always trusted you. But lately, I've been wondering if that trust was misplaced." His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything. "I found the watch, Victor," I continued, "and I've seen the messages. I know what's been going on." He exhaled through his nose, like he was trying to keep his composure. "Sir, don't bother denying it." I cut him off. "I'm not here to listen to excuses. I'm here to let you know that you've made a mistake. A big one." His posture shifted slightly, like he was preparing to defend himself, but I wasn't interested in hearing whatever story he had prepared. "You think you've been careful, but you haven't," I said. "And now, you're going to pay for it." He looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground, as if he already knew how this would end. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the garage. This was only the beginning. There was more to come, and when it was over, both he and Claire would regret ever thinking they could fool me. I didn't confront Claire right away. There was no rush, at least not yet. I wanted her to feel comfortable, safe in her lies, just long enough for me to rip the rug out from under her. The satisfaction wouldn't come from the confrontation itself. No, the real victory would be in watching her face crumble when she realized that everything she had hidden was laid bare. The next morning, as I was getting dressed for work, I saw Claire standing by the window, sipping her coffee and staring out at the garden. She looked peaceful, like someone without a single worry. It was almost infuriating how easily she could pretend. I buttoned my shirt slowly, observing her reflection in the glass. How long had she been lying to me? How many mornings like this had she spent thinking I was oblivious? I could almost hear the smugness in her silence. "Are you driving yourself today?" she asked, turning to face me. I nodded. "Yeah, I'll take care of it." She smiled, as if that was just another detail in her perfect routine. But inside, I could feel the cracks deepening, my patience wearing thinner by the minute. She kissed me on the cheek before heading to the kitchen, leaving the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. I used to love that smell. Now it turned my stomach. By the time I got to the office, I already had a plan in place. It wasn't complex, but it didn't need to be. The truth was simple, and the fallout would be devastating. I texted Claire during lunch. "Dinner tonight at our favorite spot. 8 p.m. Don't be late." She responded almost immediately. "Sounds perfect. Can't wait." I wondered if she was texting Victor right after me, warning him to stay out of sight. Maybe they had a routine for nights like this. Maybe he'd pick her up later, and they'd laugh at how easily I could be fooled. But tonight I wasn't playing their game. I was rewriting the rules. The restaurant was dimly lit, with soft jazz playing in the background. We had been coming here for years, usually to celebrate anniversaries or special occasions. Tonight, though, the only thing being celebrated was the beginning of the end. Claire looked beautiful, as always. She wore a dark green dress that hugged her figure, her hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. Anyone watching us would have thought we were just another happy couple sharing a romantic evening. But I knew better. Over appetizers, she talked about her day, how she had gone shopping with a friend and found a dress she thought I'd like. I nodded along, pretending to care, but my mind was elsewhere. I was waiting for the right moment, for her to get comfortable enough to let her guard down completely. It came halfway through the main course, when she leaned forward and touched my hand across the table. "It's nice, isn't it?" she said softly. "Just the two of us?" I stared at her for a moment, wondering how someone could lie so effortlessly. "It is," I replied, my voice steady. "But there's something we need to talk about." Her smile faltered, just for a second, before she recovered. "What's that?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, setting it on the table between us. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to me, but she didn't say anything. "You left something behind," I said. "Or rather, Victor did." She froze. It was brief, barely noticeable, but I caught it. Her fingers tightened around her fork, and her breathing shifted ever so slightly. "I don't know what you mean," she said, forcing a laugh. "Victor? What does he have to do with anything?" I tapped the screen of my phone, bringing up the photo of her and Victor in the back seat of the car. I turned it toward her, watching her reaction carefully. She stared at it for a long moment, her face draining of color. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "Does it matter?" I asked. "It exists. That's what matters." She pushed her plate aside, suddenly unable to meet my gaze. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then explain it to me," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks exactly like what I think it is." She swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. "It was a mistake," she said finally. "It didn't mean anything." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It didn't mean anything? You've been sneaking around with my driver, lying to my face, and now you want to tell me it didn't mean anything?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. "Please," she begged. "Let me explain. I'm listening." She wiped her eyes, her voice cracking as she spoke. "It started a few months ago. I don't know why, it just happened. I didn't mean for it to. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," I said, cutting her off. "And don't tell me you didn't know what you were doing. You made a choice." She nodded slowly, as if she couldn't argue with that. "I know," she whispered. "I know I messed up, but please don't do anything drastic. We can fix this." I stared at her, wondering if she truly believed that. Did she think I was the kind of man who could forgive something like this? Did she think a few tears and a heartfelt apology would erase the betrayal? "We're past fixing this," I said, my voice cold. "You should have thought about that before you crawled into the back seat with him." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly, but I didn't reach out to comfort her. This was her mess, and she needed to feel every bit of it. "I'll pack my things," she said between sobs. "I'll leave if that's what you want." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You're not leaving," I said. "Not yet. There's more I need to know." She looked up, confusion and fear etched across her face. "More?" I nodded. "I want the truth. All of it. And if you lie to me again, I'll make sure you regret it." Her sobs grew quieter, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip completely. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the Claire I thought I knew. She was a stranger, a liar who had gotten too comfortable living a double life. But now, she was trapped, and I was the one holding the keys. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. We left the restaurant in silence. Claire had barely touched her food, and I had lost my appetite halfway through watching her break down. She walked a few paces ahead of me, her heels clicking against the pavement, her arms crossed tightly against her chest like she was shielding herself from the cold. Or from me. The soft glow of the streetlights reflected off her tear-streaked face, but I didn't feel any pity. When we got home, she went straight to the living room and collapsed onto the couch, her shoulders shaking as she tried to stifle her sobs. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and took a moment to compose myself. I wasn't finished with her yet. I stood in the doorway, watching her bury her face in her hands. She had always been good at pretending, but tonight there was no mask, no charm to hide behind. Just raw, exposed guilt. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. She didn't look up. "I already told you it was a mistake." "No," I said, stepping into the room. "You told me what you thought I wanted to hear. Now, you're going to tell me the truth. When did it start?" She wiped her eyes and took a deep breath before answering. 6 months ago." I clenched my jaw, my fists tightening at my sides. 6 months. 6 months of lies, of stolen moments in my car, of making a fool out of me. "How?" I asked. "How did it start?" She hesitated, and for a second, I thought she might lie again. But then she sighed, as if the weight of it all was finally too much to carry. "It wasn't planned," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had a fight with you that night. You probably don't even remember. Something stupid. You left for a business trip the next morning, and she stopped, her lips trembling. Victor was there. He offered to drive me to an appointment. We started talking, and one thing led to another. "Spare me the details," I said sharply. "I don't need to hear how it just happened. I want to know how many times." She pressed her fingers to her forehead, like she was trying to push the memory away. "I don't know. Guess. Maybe once a week," she admitted, her voice breaking. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to hear everything before I decided what came next. "And where did it happen?" "In my car." "Sometimes," she said, "but not always. There was a hotel. And once." I held up a hand to stop her. I didn't need the mental image of my wife tangled up with my driver in a hotel bed. My grip on control was already slipping, and I couldn't afford to lose it now. "Did he mean anything to you?" She shook her head quickly, as if that answer would make it better. "No, it wasn't about him. I was just lonely." "Lonely?" I let out a bitter laugh. "You had everything. A house, vacations, freedom. And me. What part of that wasn't enough?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know why I did it." "Don't give me that," I snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing every time you snuck around with him. You knew, and you didn't stop." She buried her face in her hands again, sobbing harder. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry." Her apology felt hollow, like an empty echo in a room full of shattered glass. "Sorry doesn't change anything," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "It doesn't erase the months you spent betraying me. It doesn't erase the fact that you let another man touch you while I trusted you." Her sobs quieted, but her body trembled like she was on the verge of falling apart. "Please," she begged, "just tell me what you want me to do." I walked over to the couch and sat on the edge of the coffee table in front of her, forcing her to look at me. "I want to know if you're still in contact with him." She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "You are," I said, leaning back and running a hand through my hair. "Even after I confronted you at dinner, you're still thinking about him." "No," she said quickly, reaching for my hand, but I pulled away before she could touch me. "I'll block him. I'll end it. Just don't give up on us." Her desperation was palpable, but I wasn't sure if it was genuine or if she was just afraid of the consequences. Maybe she didn't want to lose the life we had built together, or maybe she didn't want to be exposed as the woman who destroyed her marriage over a fling with the hired help. "I need time," I said, standing up, "and don't expect me to forgive you. Not now. Maybe not ever." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand." I didn't respond. I grabbed my coat, walked to the front door, and stepped outside into the crisp night air. The cold hit me like a slap, but it was exactly what I needed. I got into my car and drove, not knowing where I was going, only that I couldn't be in that house any longer. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and empty. I thought about Victor, how he had looked at me when I confronted him, how he hadn't even tried to fight back. Maybe he thought he could still come out of this unscathed. Maybe he thought I would just let it go. But I wouldn't. This wasn't over. Not for him, and certainly not for Claire. There was a storm coming, and they had no idea how bad it was about to get. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring past me as my mind raced through every possibility. The anger simmered beneath the surface, no longer burning hot, but cold and methodical. Claire's betrayal wasn't just a wound. It was a challenge. And I wasn't going to let her or Victor walk away without feeling the full weight of their choices. When I finally pulled into the driveway, it was past midnight. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of a lamp in the living room. I figured she'd fallen asleep on the couch, but as I opened the front door, I saw her sitting there, wide awake, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. Her eyes met mine, swollen and red from crying. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Thinking," I replied, closing the door behind me and locking it. Deciding what to do next. Her breath hitched, and she placed her phone face down on the coffee table. "Have you decided?" I nodded. "Yeah, I have." I walked past her and into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water to steady my nerves. She followed, stopping at the doorway like she was too afraid to come closer. "I'm ending this," I said, setting the glass down with a thud. "But not the way you think." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I'm not going to drag this through court yet," I said, leaning against the counter. "Not until I've dealt with him first." She took a cautious step forward, her hands clasped in front of her like she was trying to appear innocent. "Please don't do anything crazy. He's not worth it." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, I'm not planning on getting my hands dirty. I'm smarter than that." Her face paled, and I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out what I had planned. She was panicking, and I enjoyed watching her squirm. "Victor is fired," I said, effective immediately. I already sent the message to the car service company. "He'll be blacklisted from driving for anyone I know." She exhaled sharply, as if she had expected something worse. "Okay, that's fair. He's out of our lives. We can move on." I shook my head. "You don't get it, Claire. I'm not done yet." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. I could see the fears settling in now, like a shadow creeping over her. "I made a few calls tonight," I continued. "I know where he lives. I know the gym he goes to, the coffee shop he visits every morning, and the friends he hangs out with. I'm going to make sure that wherever he turns, he feels my presence. I'll let him wonder when it's coming, and when it does, he won't even see it." Her hands trembled. "You can't do that." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Watch me." Tears welled up in her eyes again, and this time I didn't care. She had built this mess, and now she had to live with the consequences. "You wanted excitement, right?" I said, my voice dripping with venom. "Well, here it is." I turned to leave, but she grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please," she begged, "don't ruin your life over this." "I'm begging you." I yanked my arm away. "My life was ruined the moment you crawled into the back seat of that car." She fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched her for a moment, The woman I had once loved reduced to this broken version of herself. But I didn't feel sorry for her. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. Without another word, I walked upstairs to our bedroom and shut the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, my mind replaying everything she had confessed. The hotel rooms, the excuses, the lies, it all played in my head like a film I couldn't shut off. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. The next morning, Claire was gone. I didn't know if she'd gone to stay with a friend or if she was just trying to give me space, but I didn't care. I had other matters to deal with. I called a contact of mine, a lawyer I trusted, and asked him to meet me for coffee. He was blunt, the kind of guy who didn't sugarcoat anything, which was exactly what I needed. I'm not filing for divorce yet, I told him as we sat across from each other. I want to make sure she knows what it feels like to lose everything before she even gets a chance to fight for it. He nodded, sipping his coffee. You have enough leverage. The photo, the messages, that's more than enough to control the narrative. We can draft an agreement that puts her at a disadvantage. I leaned back, satisfied. Good. I want her scared. I want her thinking I'll expose everything if she tries to take anything from me. And Victor? He asked. I smirked. Victor will get what's coming to him. Slowly. The lawyer chuckled. Remind me never to get on your bad side. I paid for our coffees and left, feeling more in control than I had in days. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was mine on my terms. By the time I got home that evening, Claire was back. She sat at the dining room table, her eyes swollen, a half-empty glass of wine in front of her. She didn't say anything as I walked in, and I didn't offer her any comfort. I dropped a stack of papers on the table in front of her. Read them, I said. This is the deal I'm offering. Sign it, and I'll keep this quiet. Refuse, and you can imagine what happens next. Her hands trembled as she picked up the papers. You're really doing this? I am. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just nodded, as if she had finally accepted that she had lost. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the terms, and when she reached the end, she picked up a pen and signed her name. I took the papers, slid them into my briefcase, and headed upstairs without another word. It was over, or at least, it would be for her. For Victor, things were just getting started.